Alright, everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Don Ross. He is head of the School of Sociology, Philosophy, Criminology, Government and Politics at the University College Cork in Ireland, Professor of Economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and Program Director for Methodology at the Center for Economic Analysis of Risk at Georgia State University in the US. His research focuses on the foundations of economic theory, the experimental economics of addiction, risk and time preference, philosophy of science, and infrastructure, trade and industry policy in Africa. He is also the author of books like Economic Theory and Cognitive Science, Microexplanation, The Pico-Economics and Neuroeconomics of Disordered Gambling, and Everything Must Go, Metaphysics, Naturalized, and Philosophy of Economics. So, Dr. Ross, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ricardo.
Oh, it's a
Please
pleasure.
call me Don. Please call me.
Oh, okay, I will try to do it, because here in Portugal we have this bad habit of always using the title of the person we're talking with, so... Okay, so anyway, the first question I would like to ask you is, and also because you have this book, that the last one that I referred to, about metaphysics, naturalized and things like that. So what is the naturalistic approach, and why can we be so sure that we can trust it at an epistemological level? And I also want to ask you that because it seems that even nowadays people discuss if naturalism is really the best approach to solve some issues, particularly the ones related to some metaphysical questions and also ethics and morality and other stuff like that.
Right. Well, naturalism has been used over many decades to mean different things. The most basic meaning of naturalism is simply suspension of any hypothesis of supernatural phenomena or supernatural causes. That weak form of naturalism has been prevalent in most philosophy and all philosophy of science in the West, at least for 100 years or more. It's arguably always been the prevalent philosophy of Asia. So, at least China and Japan through East Asia. But that's such a weak form of naturalism, it's probably not that interesting. The kind of naturalism that James Ladyman and I defend in our book has as its opponent view, what the force of the naturalism is really denial of the idea that we can usefully approach the world when we're trying to find out what its objective character is like, when we're trying to find out about causes and processes and what exists. And we deny that when we approach those kinds of questions, we usefully do so by assuming in advance that it must conform to certain categories that arise from our everyday interaction with objects and events. That was a bit of a mouthful, so let me try and unpack it a bit. Even after most philosophers abandoned commitment to or even serious entertainment of supernatural phenomena, they continued through most of the history of what is often called analytic philosophy to suppose that their job was to take the results of science or take the results of human experience and frame them through a system of traditional metaphysical categories. Our naturalism consists in denying that that is a reliable epistemic approach, denying that that in general will deliver truth or get us closer to truth. We certainly don't insist that that pursuit of empirical science is always necessarily going to work or work well. Empirical science, the empirical science finds some domains easier and some domains harder. There may well be domains where in principle, we will never get very close to the truth, though we can't in advance know what those might be. Really, our naturalism consists simply in the view that we don't have any better alternative. There's no better method of finding out what the world is like than refining observation, modeling those observations rigorously, and testing the models against experience. In other words, empirical science is not perfect. Empirical science comes with no guarantees, but there's no other epistemological approach to objectivity that competes with it in any significant sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I would also like to ask you, what is the role that philosophy still plays in our current world and in our current affairs, and particularly when it comes to how science is conducted and how the scientific method works? Because, I mean, since philosophy was birthed, let's say, in ancient Greece, or even a little bit before that, because it is still argued. But, I mean, before the rise of the scientific method and an empirical approach to many of the questions that we want to answer, practically all of those questions were addressed by, let's say, armchair philosophers. But nowadays, many of them went from philosophy to science to resolve. But so, what is the role that philosophy can still play, perhaps in aiding science to do its work?
That's a great question, Ricardo. Many philosophers of science have thought and have argued that philosophy can help science in two ways, by forcing scientists to be more explicit about their methods on the one hand, and by refining and clarifying some of the concepts that scientists use in their practical, time-pressured engagements with reality. I'm skeptical about both of those possible ways in which philosophy could contribute. I don't think there is any interesting thing called the scientific method. We can talk about the scientific methods that were promoted by, say, Galileo and Bacon and Newton at the beginning of the scientific revolution. We can certainly identify their methods, but that's only because it was early days, and we're identifying their methods by contrast with the kinds of epistemological methods that were used before them. When we fast forward to the contemporary scientific scene, what we find is that most scientific progress has been made by an ever accelerating, ever deepening, ever widening division of labor. Right? It's crucial to scientific progress that scientists specialize, that individual scientists and teams of scientists become highly, highly expert on a quite specific domain of investigation. Mm-hmm. In consequence, also, we find a proliferation of concepts. So one might pick a standard concept that's used across the sciences. Take the concept of gene, right, as in biology, genetics. Well, it turns out that the concept of gene is used in importantly different ways, even within different parts of biology. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't add value, in my opinion, for philosophers to come along and ask themselves, what do all those concepts of gene have in common? And try to distill out of that some, as it were, core meaning of the concept of gene. I see no particular reason to think there should be any core meaning of that kind to be had. Gene means what it means in the context in which it's used. And the more we try to generalize about across all of those contexts, the more we just lose information. But in what I've just said is the seeds of the positive view I take concerning what philosophy can still contribute, and indeed necessarily and very, very importantly must be asked to contribute. It's a perfectly reasonable question for someone to ask. How does the world as a whole hang together? How is it possible that in one world we can have the generalizations of quantum physics, the discoveries of molecular biology, the working models of economics, what is the relationship between quantum chemistry and the various branches of quantum physics, and so on. And notice, none of these questions about how it all hangs together are no particular scientists. Answering those is not in any particular scientist's job description, just for the reasons I started off by saying. Science progresses through specialization. That's how it achieves most of its deep knowledge. But of course, the more it specializes, the more we can start to lose our grip on what the general character of the world is, how science is unified. And if we surrender that ambition, if we say, well, who cares, right? Let's just pursue all the various branches of science. Let's just have scattered islands of knowledge that we don't bother trying to connect. Well, in that case, one will have surrendered one of the, I think, core epistemic ambitions of humanity. So that's the job description for philosophers of science, making connections. So philosophers of science inevitably will know less about most scientists and most sciences than the scientists who practice them do. But a good philosopher, and no philosopher of science, by the way, can have knowledge all the way across the sciences. That's simply impossible. I mean, it's not possible in one human lifetime to acquire that. Mm-hmm. But teams of philosophers, each of whom is expert on some interdisciplinary connections, can jointly contribute to the old philosophical project, which arguably was the basic philosophical project at the dawn of Hellenic civilization, saying something about the general structure and character of the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so perhaps it would be interesting to illustrate all of what you just said with a very specific example that also comes from your work. So I would like to talk a little bit about economics and the philosophy of economics, because I think that perhaps economics as a discipline has been struggling since its inception, let's say, with some big issues, and some of them I will want to talk later, particularly about how we define the economic agent and how it really works and things like that. But perhaps there are even other questions that also the approach that economists have to them have changed throughout time, and some of them might be specific to economics and others particularly are more general to all the social sciences, because I guess that one issue that we have with the social sciences in particular is that there are several levels of analysis that we can take, from overt behavior to activity in the brain to genetics and all of those things that really complicate the picture here.
Yeah, that's right. So what's the question? You'd like an example of interdisciplinary unification?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and perhaps, so I've referred to the economic agent and how it has been defined throughout time since the inception of economics, but perhaps there are other big questions that economics also changed the way it tackles them since its beginning. So I don't know, what would you like to tell us about that specifically?
Yeah, well, the history of a science like economics looks crucially different depending on the perspective on the perspective one takes to it. So, for example, when do we regard economics as having really begun? If we regard economics as having begun with Aristotle and his practical concerns with managing a household, then it has one kind of history. If we think that economics really didn't begin until the marginal revolution of the 1870s, then it has another different kind of history. The standard view that modern economics really begins with Adam Smith and his contemporaries, I think, is a reasonable one. It's not forced, but it's one that I find illuminating. So it's the one I'll work from here. If we think of economics as that discipline that was roughly, loosely, approximately founded by Adam Smith and his immediate successors, then I think we could say that the central, persistent, big theme of the economic project is the following. Smith recognized that we build wealth, we achieve technological and material progress as a species, mainly by dividing labor and by specializing our labor. In other words, we exploit our ability to be able to give ourselves complementary roles in production. The moment we recognize that we build wealth by dividing labor, we immediately realize we've got a set of practical problems that we otherwise would not have. And one crucial practical problem is, having divided labor, we then need to design various kinds of incentive structures to coordinate that divided labor, so that because there are many, many ways of dividing labor. Some of them are very inefficient, others are more efficient. For any particular way of dividing labor, we can ask, is there a better way to do it? We can easily and always find worse ways to do it. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, having identified a better way to do it, or a best way to do it, we then have to ask what structures can hold it together. It's not enough to just identify the best way of coordinating divided labor. We actually have to give people reasons to want to participate in that coordination in efficient ways. That is to say, we need to design incentive schemes and design institutions. That's where it's only at that point that we start wondering about economic agency. The moment we I think that our problem is a problem of figuring out how to incentivize people to reliably perform certain roles and maintain certain structures and play their parts in certain kinds of institutions. The moment we see that it's about incentives, we immediately are talking about agency, right? Agency just is that aspect of a system's response, whether we're talking about a person or a firm or a household or a labor union or a political party or a dog or an elephant, right? When we start talking about incentives, when we start talking about inducing behavior by offering certain kinds of benefits or threatening certain kinds of costs, we're talking about agents. That's what agents are. That's what, that just is what agency is. So, in other words, agency is not conceptually primordial here. We face issues in modeling agency because of the deeper target of economic explanation and inquiry, namely incentives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, is it the case that that in economics we have different approaches when we're analyzing economic events or economic phenomena at different levels? Like, for example, when we're analyzing phenomena that are part of macroeconomics and microeconomics, and perhaps when we're analyzing individual and collective agents, or not?
Yes, of course. Those are challenges. I mean, something that I think confuses many people about economics, including many economics students, because of the way we teach economics, particularly at the undergraduate level, is the relationship between modeling individuals and modeling groups. In teaching economics, we often start with Robinson Crusoe, this lone agent alone on an island who has to decide how to allocate his time between, say, making a fishing rod and harvesting fruit out of the trees. And then once he's got his fishing rod, how much of the day should he spend fishing? How much should he spend looking for fruit? And so on, right? We do all that, and because one of the things we're trying to teach the students at that point is really how to solve optimization problems using calculus. Right, and that's a convenient setting for doing that. That gives the impression that somehow economics is fundamentally and in the first place about individual behavior. And that creates a real disconnect in students' expectations about what they're going to go on to learn. Because, in fact, economists are very seldom interested in individuals and in individual behavior. Almost all of, if you just pull any issue of a top economics journal off the shelf and look at what the papers are about, They're almost all about household responses or firm responses or the coordination of firms or the relationships between firms as producers and households as consumers. Very, very little is about individuals. It's quite unusual in economics, for example, to model the utility function of an individual. There are circumstances under which one does do it, and my group does it to an unusual extent for reasons we might get into later, but it's actually not common. I would argue, and you might want to follow this up, but I'll hand back to you for that. I would argue that if you are really serious about doing an economics of the individual human being, then what you're going to be doing is pico-economics, or what George Ainsley calls pico-economics. But very few economists actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about pico-economics, but just before that, I would also want you to tell us about this. There has been throughout most of economics history this wrong idea that, or at least that we nowadays know that it is not really correct, the idea of individuals acting as rational agents or what has been called homo economicus. But is it true that at the individual level that idea doesn't really hold water, but perhaps when we're talking about collectives, that perhaps there's something to it, and perhaps we would have rationality, let's say, as an emergent property, or not?
Well, these are very, very complicated matters, and I'll have to ask you to be a bit patient as I pull them apart. So a first point is that I think the Homo economicus is given much more prominence in certain kinds of popular myths about economics than it has actually played in real economics. There's no trace, really, of Homo economicus in the first half of the 20th century economics. Homo economicus does not show up. Mm-hmm. There's no Homo economicus in Adam Smith. There's no Homo economicus in Ricardo or Marx. You can see traces of him in John Stuart Mill, but you would certainly, Homo economicus is certainly not the star of the story in Mill's political economy. When the rational maximizing consumer is rigorously defined for the first time in the history of economics in Paul Samuelson's work just after World War II. Mm-hmm. Samuelson himself, in the chapter where he constructs that model, says at the end of the chapter that he doesn't know whether this model really has any particular grip on reality. And furthermore, he says, if it doesn't really matter. And why would one say? There's Homo economicus finally being, as it were, nailed into being. And the person doing the nailing says it doesn't matter whether this really has any great empirical applicability. And to bear that out, in the rest of Samuelson's 500-page text, that analysis does not do any more work. So indeed, you can see why Samuelson thinks it wouldn't matter. The concept isn't really used again. Why does he bother then to do that analysis? He's really doing that analysis as a way of pinning down for mathematical modeling purposes some concepts that have nothing in particular to do with individual human beings. He's trying to nail down relationships between, for example, marginal demand and marginal consumption. He's trying to find a way of representing diminishing marginal returns in a way that doesn't appeal to any psychological properties, because he knows we're going to want to apply those concepts to what firms do, to what households do, to all sorts of entities, and we need to mathematically mean the same thing each time we do one of those analyses. Again, there's that textbook model of Robinson Crusoe. So the first time the student encounters those concepts about optimization on margins and those concepts relating to demand and time allocation and so on, they see them in this cartoon setting of an individual person making these simple decisions about how to allocate their resources. And then they naively think, right, well, that's what economics is about. Mm-hmm. Now, it is true that economics, along with Western philosophy and social sciences in general, during the 20th century, passed through an intensely atomistic phase. That is, it passed through a phase in which the intellectual culture of the sciences was heavily analytic. That is to say, a lot of energy was put in to figuring out how we could understand systems by decomposing them into their parts. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you are studying society or you're studying social groups, and you think that one of the things you should do is decompose them into their parts to gain enlightenment and insight, then those parts will naturally be human beings, individual people. You'll think of those as the sort of fundamental parts. You'll think of the people as the atoms. And then, of course, if you're doing this as an economist, you say, well, do I have a model of these atoms? Yeah, there it is. It's in Samuelson, right? It's Homo economicus, right? It's that individual who is perfectly efficient in the way, who perfectly efficiently optimizes given a budget constraint, right? That's what Homo economicus does. Mixed up with all of that is yet another thing. Economic rationality, as people discuss it and as you see it in textbooks, it partly involves being very efficient with respect to being as efficient as possible with respect to one's resources, and being perfectly consistent in one's preferences, since if you're not perfectly consistent in your preferences, you can't possibly expect to be consistent in your use of resources, right? If you change your mind, that will have implications for how the choices you made yesterday, some of them will need revision. Well, to that extent, I guess you weren't efficient, were you? But then it also comes to involve, right? If economic rationality also comes to involve the idea of making use of all information that is in principle available about whatever problem you're facing. Now, that's a very, very strange concept of rationality. It has nothing to do with rationality in any psychological sense at all, right? Nobody thinks that psychological rationality requires that one actually use all information that is in principle available, right? Try living your life like that, right? It's impossible for a minute. So why does that feature in economics? It doesn't feature in economics because any economist was ever so foolish as to think that that was something individual people do or should do. It's reflected in economics because economists don't want economics is a policy science, and economists are wary of giving advice to policymakers that will only work if the people to whom the policy is being applied are assumed to be in principle ignorant about something, right? If you make a policy that requires that everybody stay ignorant, well, sooner or later they'll cure that ignorance. So you model as if all the information will be picked up in the system, not because you think it actually is or will be, but because it's extremely dangerous and guaranteed to fail. If you model the system, if your model of the system, your model of the intervention you're going to make on the system depends on the perpetuation of some special ignorance. Well, that's a lot that I've just been through, so let me try to summarize it. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's no simple concept of economic rationality. Economists use rationality in a variety of different ways, which are clear to them from context. Critics then step back and try to distill or analyze out a general concept of economic rationality that always leads them to say things that aren't true, that always leads to outrageous simplification of what economists are really doing. Second, the idea of the perfectly rational economic individual is a concept of actually very little importance in economics. Samuelson was quite right about that. It's very useful to learn that concept for the sake of learning other concepts. It's very useful to kind of have that concept in mind when you're writing down a model of what is usually an agent that is typically not an individual person, like a labor union or a company. But economists are not in the business and have never been in the business of modeling the world as if individual human beings map onto Homo economicus. I'll make just one caveat, and this is also an important contributor to the current mythology. There was a group of economists who were concentrated at the University of Chicago in the late 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s, who actually tried to make a serious go of the program of modeling individual people as if they were approximated by Homo economicus. I think that program yielded some insights, but among the famous leading programs of economics, I think it was among the most barren in its upshots. I think it was it was one of the few big movements in economics that I think actually created more confusion than enlightenment. Unfortunately, those economists were also very good self-promoters, and quite a lot of people got the idea that they were representative of the discipline. Let me a caveat on the caveat. I think they were all brilliant people. I'm glad they did the work that they did. Gary Becker fully deserves the Nobel Prize that he got. I'm really complaining about the way in which the self-mythologizing of those economists got picked up and inflated and amplified and generalized. That's the closest. If you want, though, to see that kind of mythological Homo economicus based economics at work, that's where you look. Just remember when you're looking there, this is not representative of the discipline as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and since we're talking about the behavior of an animal, that in this case is Homo sapiens, and how it responds to certain environmental cues, and also our innate biases and heuristics in dealing, in this case, with economic information, and how we construct our societies and, of course, our socialization in general. So could you please expand a little bit more on the relationship between economics and other social sciences like psychology and sociology and other things like that? And I don't know if you would prefer to highlight more the differences or the similarities or perhaps the interplay between them.
Let me start with psychology, because I think the story there is more complicated, and it's certainly it connects more directly with the themes we were just talking about a moment ago. There is, of course, such a thing as social psychology, and social psychology arguably is growing in importance within psychology as a whole. So let me just bracket that, because nothing that I'm about to say really applies to social psychology, right? These disciplines are moving things, they're living things, and psychology will change. So when I talk about psychology, I'm talking about psychology as it has been dominated by its main parts over the past few decades. Thus qualified. Psychology really is about individuals. Mm-hmm. The primary explanatory target of the psychologist really is, how does the individual human being, as a motivated, thinking, feeling, perceiving, knowing, acting entity work, right? How does that thing mechanically work? How do the various processes that are going on in the brain of that thing drive its behavior, unify its perceptions, inform its consciousness, cause and modulate its motivations, and so on, right? That's ultimately what psychologists are interested in. As I was stressing a few minutes ago, that is not what economists are interested in. Let me tell a story that I think can help illustrate the point. I have, as an economist, often done experiments with psychologists, and in the about 10 years ago, 10 to 12 years ago, I ran a series of experiments on problem gamblers with psychologists. And when we used to design our experiments, there would be some psychologists in the room and some economists. And as we were designing the experiments and troubleshooting our experimental designs, we would naturally identify some factors that we needed to take into account that would probably arise and affect the experiment that we hadn't thought of when we did our first pass design. You know, that's how you do experimental design. You start with a kind of rough sketch and then you troubleshoot it. Every time there was a common pattern I soon noticed, that when we identified a factor that we hadn't considered that would possibly affect our results or our observations, the instinct of the psychologists was to figure out how we could wall that factor out of the lab. Right? They would call it a confound. Right? That's what it's known as. And they would say, we've got to get that confound out. We've got to block its operation. Mm-hmm. The economists would have exactly the opposite approach. Having identified the factor, their approach would be saying, how can we get that factor into the lab in a controlled way? Right? Which usually would mean spending more money, because the way you would bring the confound into the lab in a controlled way is you would take a subset of your participants, of your subjects, and make a new treatment group of them. That is, you'd actually deliberately subject them to the new factor in a way that differed from the exposure to that factor of your other groups. That's how you would bring the factor into the lab. This says a lot to me. This revealed a lot to me about the difference between psychology and economics. Why did the psychologists always want to block things out of the lab? Because the reason is because the ultimate explanatory ideal for the psychologists is the person operating by means of their, as it were, raw brain. Right? The person stripped out of their context, so they've got to use the native resources that they either were born with or have learned, so that we're finding out how the mechanisms and the internal processes, as it were, of the person really operate. The economist is actually a social scientist. The economist is typically interested in how some structures work. They're interested in how some socialized and institutionalized processes actually unfold. So the economist wants to bring as much of the world into the lab as she possibly can. Exactly, the opposite to what the psychologist does. I think this generalizes. Despite the so-called individualism for which economists are famous, the interest of the economist ultimately is a person embedded in a market or embedded in a set of institutions like firms and so on, households. And for the economist, the specific ways, the specific information processing that goes on within the person is of no special interest. The economist it matters every bit as much to the economist information that is processed externally to the person, information that is processed in the person's environment and that the person just uses, or that just affects the person, even without perhaps the person being aware of it. Those things, all of those sources of information, all of that information processing is of equal interest to the economist. And often the economist doesn't really care whether the information is being processed in the person, by the person in their brain, or in the environment that the person is using. Whereas those distinctions matter a great deal to the psychologist. They're really what psychology is about. Now, sociology, then, is not as distinct from economics as psychology is. Economics is a social science, and sociology is a social science. Some might even argue that sociology is kind of the core social science, in the sense that sociologists will regard anything that is social as falling within their explanatory purview. I think that the the disciplinary distinction between economics and sociology is largely a historical artifact. That is, it's a product of some complicated historical factors that happened to be present in the intellectual environment in which the formal social sciences were born in the 19th century, given the particular investigative techniques that were available to people, given the way other sciences like psychology and biology were then being practiced. Sociologists and economists looked like to each other, looked like they were doing very, very different things. I think we're gradually starting to realize that the project of the social sciences actually requires both sociology and economics. That is requires reflection on the phenomena that economists have studied, but also the phenomena that sociologists study. Sociologists are no longer allergic to mathematics in the way that they were incentivized to be for most of the 20th century. Economists are quite willing to model and talk about power differentials, which some of them in the 20th century were allergic to, and which therefore became kind of defining focus of sociology. I think there are good reasons to think that the only things now keeping sociology and economics from merging into a single transdisciplinary social science are institutional factors, as opposed to deep philosophical or epistemological factors.